Dirt doesn't care who owns it. It just waits. It absorbs the rain it yields the harvest, and it outlasts every single person who claims to hold the deed. But in my family, dirt wasn't just real estate. It was blood. It was legacy. My grandfather understood that better than anyone. He was a man carved out of the old world, a veteran who spent his youth in the jungles of Vietnam and his later years pulling a living out of 500 acres of prime Midwest soil. He didn't talk much, but he watched everything. And when he passed away, his will sent a shockwave through the family that I'm still feeling the echoes of today. He didn't leave the farm to his only son, my Uncle Robert. He bypassed him entirely. Instead, the deed, the acreage, and the legacy were left to me, a 25-year-old female Army aviator. I still remember the day the lawyer read the will. Uncle Robert sat across the mahogany table, his face flushing a deep, mottled red, though he tried to mask it behind a tight, magnanimous smile. Granddad had left a letter for me alongside the deed. It was short, just 3 lines. To my granddaughter Carter. You know what it means to hold the line, protect the soil. Don't let the talkers take what the workers built. Granddad knew exactly who Robert was. My uncle was a man who loved the aesthetic of the American farmer, but despised the labor. He was the kind of guy who wore pristine, unblemished work boots to the country club. He talked a big game about tradition, family values, and the sanctity of the land, but his hands were soft. He had spent his entire life bouncing from one failed business venture to another, always looking for a shortcut, always relying on his last name to open doors he hadn't earned the right to walk through. But the farm was mine now. 500 acres of rolling earth, bordered by thick tree lines and heavy iron gates. And it wasn't just any land. If you stood on the highest ridge of the property, right at the northern boundary, you didn't just see corn or soybeans. Less than 10 miles away, dominating the horizon, was a strategic Air Force base. It was a massive, highly classified installation. On any given Tuesday, you could feel the vibration in the dirt before you even heard the roar of the engines, looking up to see B-2 Spirit bombers and F-22 Raptors cutting through the clouds. Growing up, that sound was my lullaby. It was the reason I joined the military. The airspace above my grandfather's farm was practically a heavily monitored federal highway. That geographical detail was something I always loved. To my Uncle Robert, as I would later find out, it was a multi-million-dollar vulnerability. 4 months after I inherited the property, my orders came down. I was deploying to the Middle East. I fly the AH-64 Apache. When you sit in the cockpit of an attack helicopter, your entire world narrows down to your instrument panel, your gunner, and the horizon. You cannot afford distractions. You cannot afford to have your mind wandering thousands of miles away to property taxes, irrigation systems, or crop yields. I needed someone to watch the farm. And like a vulture circling a wounded animal, Uncle Robert swooped in. He drove up to my base a week before my deployment. He took me out to dinner, bought me a steak, and looked me dead in the eye with that practiced, sincere expression he had perfected over 50 years of manipulating people. "Carter," he said, reaching across the table to pat my hand. "You're doing your duty for this country. It's an honor. But you can't manage a 500-acre farm from a combat zone. Let me step in. Let me do my duty for the family. I'll manage the leases. I'll make sure the tenant farmers pay on time. I'll handle the USDA paperwork, the property taxes, the maintenance. You just focus on coming home in one piece. I'm your family. I've got your 6. It sounded perfect. It sounded exactly like what a supportive uncle should say. But I am an aviator. I am trained to look for anomalies, to spot the tiny discrepancies on a radar that indicate an incoming threat. I didn't trust Robert with a blank check, and I certainly didn't trust him with my grandfather's legacy. So I went to JAG, the Judge Advocate General's office. I sat down with a military lawyer and we drafted a very specific ironclad limited power of attorney. I did not give Robert the authority to sell the land. I did not give him the authority to take out a mortgage, borrow against the equity, or subdivide the property. The POA explicitly restricted his power to purely administrative tasks, collecting rent from the local farmers who leased our fields, paying the county taxes, and filing standard agricultural reports. If a tractor broke, he could authorize the repair. If a fence fell down, he could hire someone to fix it. That was it. I handed him the document the day before I shipped out. He read it over, and I saw the briefest flash of annoyance in his eyes when he realized how tight the leash was. But he quickly covered it with a smile, folded the paper, and put it in his breast pocket. "Smart girl," he said. "Always by the book. Don't worry, kiddo. Uncle Robert is holding the line." I deployed. I traded the green fields of the Midwest for the brown, dusty expanse of the sandbox. The days bled into weeks, and the weeks into months. My reality became a cycle of pre-flight briefings, nighttime operations, the heavy thrum of the Apache's rotors, and the sharp scent of aviation fuel. Every couple of weeks, when I had access to a secure terminal, I would check my personal email. And there, sitting in my inbox, would be the updates from Robert. At first, they were mundane. A broken water pump, a delayed payment from one of the tenant farmers. But by my 4th month in country, the tone of his emails began to shift. The narrative he was spinning grew dark. "Carter," he wrote in one email, "it breaks my heart to tell you this, but we are facing an unprecedented drought. The soil is turning to dust. The tenant farmers are pulling out. They say they can't make a profit this season." A month later, another email. "Total crop failure on the East Quadrant. The heat wave scorched everything before the stalks even got knee-high. I'm spending days out here trying to salvage what I can, but it's a wasteland. I'm filing the loss reports with the USDA. It's a lot of red tape, but don't worry, I'm handling it. Just focus on your mission. I'm protecting the family legacy." Month after month, it was a story of ruin. Plagues of insects, unseasonal frosts, flooding in the lower basins. According to Uncle Robert, my grandfather's pristine, fiercely resilient farm had suddenly become cursed the moment I stepped off the soil. He painted a picture of himself as the weary, dedicated steward, bleeding himself dry to keep the farm afloat, while the elements battered him from all sides. He told me the farm was operating at a massive loss, but that I shouldn't worry about sending money. He claimed he was using his own savings to cover the property taxes, just to keep the county off our backs. I read those emails, sitting in a plywood hooch, wearing a flight suit stiff with sweat halfway across the world. I felt a pang of guilt. I felt the exact emotion he was meticulously engineering me to feel. I was out here playing soldier, while my uncle was, supposedly, sacrificing his own livelihood to protect my inheritance. I sent him brief, appreciative replies. I thanked him for his sacrifice. I told him to hold on, that I would figure out a way to reimburse him when my tour was over. He responded within hours. "Family doesn't keep score, Carter. Just fly safe." I believed him. For 9 months, I believed that Uncle Robert had finally stepped up. I believed that the man who had dodged hard work his entire life had finally found his calling in preserving the dirt my grandfather bled for. I didn't know that the drought was a lie. I didn't know that the crops were growing tall and green, harvested in secret, and sold for cash under the table. And I certainly didn't know that the dirt he claimed to be protecting had already been sold out to the highest bidder in the darkest corners of international finance. He thought the miles made me blind. He thought that because I was in a combat zone, I wouldn't see the financial war zone he was building in my own backyard. He relied on the distance, the trust, and the uniform I wore to keep me completely in the dark. But Uncle Robert made a catastrophic miscalculation. He forgot that the uniform I wear comes with a security clearance. He forgot that the military doesn't just watch the enemy overseas. Sometimes they watch the horizon right at home. And when the truth finally came knocking, it didn't come in an email from my uncle. It came from the Pentagon. In the military, your life is an open book, but only to the people who hold the right clearance. When you carry a top-secret, sensitive compartmented information clearance, a TSSCI, you forfeit the luxury of financial privacy. The government needs to know you aren't a liability. They need to know you aren't drowning in debt, addicted to gambling, or vulnerable to blackmail. Every 5 years, you go through a periodic reinvestigation. You sit in a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility, which is essentially a vault with no windows, no cell phones, and no way for the outside world to bleed in. You sit across from a special agent from the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, and they walk through every single aspect of your life. I was at month 10 of my deployment when my renewal came up. I sat in a secure briefing room at our forward operating base, staring at a high-resolution video feed of a DCSA investigator sitting in a sterile office back in Virginia. For the first 20 minutes, it was standard procedure. We verified my deployments, my addresses, my immediate family contacts. But then the investigator paused. He looked down at a file outside the frame of the camera, tapped his pen against the desk, and looked back up at me with a perfectly neutral expression. "Captain Carter," he said, his voice flat through the encrypted audio channel. "Can you explain the recent influx of federal capital into the LLC registered to your primary residence?" I stared at him. "Sir, I'm not sure I follow. The only income attached to my primary residence is a few minor agricultural leases, handled by my uncle under a limited power of attorney." The investigator didn't blink. "I'm looking at your financial footprint, Captain. Over the last 10 months, a business entity named Carter Heritage Holdings, LLC, has received 3 direct Treasury wire transfers from the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation. The total amount is $1.2 million. Furthermore, this LLC has executed a high-value commercial land lease with a foreign-backed telecommunications entity." The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. I didn't have an LLC called Carter Heritage Holdings. I hadn't received a dime from the USDA, and I certainly hadn't authorized any commercial leases. My heart hammered against my ribs, a sudden violent spike of adrenaline. But I am an Apache pilot. When a warning light flashes red in the cockpit, you don't panic. You compartmentalize. You isolate the system failure. "Sir," I said, keeping my voice steady, my face entirely impassive, "I have no knowledge of that LLC, nor those transactions. I suspect my identity and my property have been compromised." The investigator watched me for a long moment. He was trained to spot microexpressions, the subtle twitches of deception. He found none. Because I wasn't lying. I was just waking up to a nightmare. He flagged my file for a secondary review and ended the interview. The moment the screen went black, I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't call Uncle Robert and scream into the receiver. Amateurs show their hand when they're emotional. Professionals gather intel. I walked out of the SCIF, went straight to my quarters, and opened my encrypted laptop. I started pulling public records, county tax filings, and USDA subsidy databases. What I found over the next 3 hours was a masterpiece of blue-collar betrayal. Uncle Robert hadn't just exaggerated a drought. He had orchestrated a massive, systematic fraud against the United States government. Using my name, my grandfather's address, and a doctored version of the power of attorney I gave him, Robert had incorporated Carter Heritage Holdings. He then filed catastrophic loss claims with the USDA's Risk Management Agency. He claimed that a freak localized blight had decimated all 500 acres of our crops. He forged soil samples. He forged weather impact reports. He milked the federal crop insurance program for over $1 million in taxpayer money, funneling it directly into his shadow LLC. But that wasn't the worst part. I pulled the digital receipts from the regional grain elevators, the massive silos where local farmers sell their harvest. My grandfather's farm hadn't suffered a blight. The crops had yielded a bumper harvest. Robert had quietly sold thousands of bushels of corn and soybeans for untraceable cash under the table, effectively double-dipping. He was getting paid by the black market for the crops and getting paid by the federal government for the fake loss. He was stealing from the dirt, and he was stealing from the crown. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes. It was bank fraud. It was wire fraud. It was aggravated identity theft. It was enough to put him in a federal penitentiary for 20 years. But as I dug deeper into the LLC's filings, I remembered the second thing the DCSA investigator had mentioned: a commercial land lease. I logged into the county clerk's portal. Sure enough, 3 months ago, Robert had signed a 99-year lease for a 10-acre parcel on the northern ridge of my farm. He leased it to a company called Apex Agritech Solutions, based out of Delaware. The lease was for the construction of an agricultural data telemetry tower, supposedly to help local farmers monitor weather patterns. The northern ridge. A cold, heavy dread settled in my stomach. I didn't need county records for this next part. I needed military assets. I walked over to the Tactical Operations Center and found a buddy of mine, an intelligence officer, who ran geospatial analysis. I told him I needed a recent, unclassified satellite pass over a specific grid coordinate in the Midwest. 10 minutes later, I was staring at a high-resolution overhead image of my grandfather's farm. The green and brown patchwork of the fields looked normal. But there, on the northern ridge, the highest elevation point in the county, was a glaring, metallic anomaly. It wasn't a standard cell tower. It was a massive 200-foot reinforced spire bristling with high-density parabolic antennas, microwave receivers, and encrypted data arrays. It was surrounded by a tall chain-link fence topped with concertina wire. I asked my intel buddy to pull the line of sight for those antennas. He clicked a few buttons, and a red laser line projected out from the tower on the digital map. The line cut straight across the 10 miles of open farmland. It bypassed the civilian town entirely. The trajectory of the antennas was pointed with dead-center precision directly at the primary runways and command bunkers of the Strategic Air Force Base. My blood ran cold. Apex Agritech Solutions wasn't monitoring weather. I ran the Delaware LLC through a corporate tracing database. It took 5 layers of shell companies bouncing from Delaware to the Cayman Islands before the ultimate beneficial owner was unmasked. It was a telecommunications conglomerate heavily backed by a hostile foreign government, a government known for conducting aggressive espionage against U.S. military installations. Uncle Robert had leased the highest point of my land to a foreign intelligence apparatus. For a massive upfront cash payout, he had handed a hostile nation a front-row seat to monitor the flight paths, telemetry data, and operational tempo of America's most advanced stealth bombers. He didn't just commit fraud. He had facilitated a national security breach on U.S. soil. I closed the laptop. The silence in my quarters was deafening. I thought about the emails. I'm protecting the family legacy. Family doesn't keep score. Robert thought he was a genius. He thought he had found the perfect victim, a soldier deployed thousands of miles away, completely detached from the civilian world. He thought he could use my land to play high-stakes games with federal money and foreign spies, assuming I would just blindly sign whatever paperwork he put in front of me when I got home. He thought the distance made him untouchable. He didn't realize that by targeting a U.S. Army officer, he hadn't just committed a white-collar crime. He had triggered the jurisdiction of the most ruthless, well-resourced investigative bodies on the planet. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything. I didn't feel an ounce of familial pity for the man who shared my last name. I felt nothing but a cold, surgical clarity. Robert had used my dirt to build his empire of lies. It was time to let the federal government bury him under it. In the military, we have a doctrine called preparation of the battlefield. You don't just charge blindly into a firefight, you shape the environment. You cut off the enemy's supply lines, you blind their sensors, and you maneuver your assets into position while they're still asleep in their racks. By the time the first shot is fired, the battle is already over. The enemy just doesn't know it yet. I wasn't about to give Uncle Robert the satisfaction of a screaming phone call. If I confronted him now, he would panic. He would shred documents, wipe hard drives, and probably try to flee the country with the money he'd siphoned from the USDA and his foreign handlers. I needed him comfortable. I needed him feeling invincible. I drafted a brief, cheerful email. "Hey, Uncle Robert. Just got off a long rotation. Sounds like you've been working miracles keeping the farm afloat despite the bad weather. Can't thank you enough. I might have a window for some emergency leave next month. I'd love to see what you've done with the place." I hit send. Then I walked directly to the Judge Advocate General's office. The JAG officer on duty was a no-nonsense major with sharp eyes and a desk covered in perfectly aligned files. I didn't waste time. I didn't tell her a sob story about family betrayal. I handed her a thick manila folder containing the property deed, the heavily restricted power of attorney, the USDA payout records I had pulled, and the unclassified satellite imagery of the telemetry tower. "Major," I said, taking a seat. "My uncle has committed aggravated identity theft and federal crop insurance fraud. Furthermore, he has leased a segment of my property to a foreign-backed entity that is actively conducting signal intelligence collection against a strategic Air Force base." The major stopped her pen, hovering over a legal pad. She looked at the satellite image, then looked at me. "Captain, are you telling me there is a foreign listening post operating on U.S. soil under your name?" "Yes, ma'am. And I want to dismantle it." The military legal system moves slowly for petty offenses, but when you drop a national security threat and multi-million-dollar federal fraud on their desk, the bureaucracy vanishes. Within 48 hours, JAG had initiated a silent coordination with the civilian authorities. The first call went to the USDA Office of Inspector General. The OIG handles agricultural fraud, and they do not mess around. When they saw the blatant discrepancy between the catastrophic loss claims and the black market grain sales, they immediately opened a criminal probe for false statements, 18 U.S.C. Section 1014, and wire fraud. The second call went higher, much higher. Because of the tower, JAG bypassed local law enforcement entirely and contacted the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. The FBI coordinates closely with the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, and enforces the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, FIRMA. FIRMA specifically grants the federal government the authority to review, block, or dismantle real estate transactions involving foreign entities near sensitive U.S. military installations. Uncle Robert's lease with the foreign shell company wasn't just illegal under my power of attorney. It was a direct violation of federal law. I spent the next 2 weeks in a strange, dual existence. By day, I flew combat missions, scanning the desert for insurgents. By night, I sat in secure video conferences with federal agents, systematically mapping out the destruction of my uncle's life. The FBI and the USDA OIG formed a joint task force. They didn't want to just arrest Robert. They wanted to seize his assets, dismantle the foreign operation, and lock everyone involved in a federal cage. But they had a logistical problem. The foreign investors, the handlers, who were actually running the data collection off the tower, were ghosts. They operated through lawyers and shell companies. To make an airtight case for espionage and conspiracy, the FBI needed Robert and the foreign operatives in the same room discussing the lease on U.S. soil. They needed a honeypot, and Uncle Robert provided the perfect jar. A week later, an email from Robert hit my inbox. It was marked urgent. Carter, great news! I've managed to secure a massive infrastructure grant to upgrade our irrigation systems. It's going to save the farm. But because the payout is so large, the county requires the actual title holder to sign the final release in person. The investors are flying in to finalize it next Friday. We're hosting a little ribbon-cutting ceremony at the farm. Can you make that leave happen? We need you here to sign. I forwarded the email to the FBI lead agent. 5 minutes later, my phone rang on the encrypted line. Captain Carter, the agent said, his voice crackling slightly over the secure channel. Your uncle isn't signing an irrigation grant. Our intercepts indicate he's finalizing a 99-year lease extension with the Foreign Shell Company. They are bringing in their technical directors to upgrade the tower's array. If they sign that document, they establish long-term legal tenancy, which makes removing them an international incident. So we don't let them sign, I replied. We need you at that table, Captain. We need you to draw them out. I'll be there. I submitted my emergency leave packet. Thanks to the quiet intervention of the Pentagon, it was approved in record time. I packed a single duffel bag. I didn't pack civilian clothes. I packed my Army Green Service uniform, my Class A's. The crisp olive fabric, the sharp creases, the gold rank insignia, and the aviator wings pinned perfectly above my ribbons. If Uncle Robert wanted to play games with my uniform, he was going to look it in the eye when the hammer fell. I flew commercial back to the States. I didn't tell Robert I had landed. I didn't tell him I was renting a car. The day of the ribbon cutting, I drove the final hour out to the farm. The Midwest sky was a bruised, heavy gray threatening rain. As I turned onto the long gravel driveway that my grandfather had laid by hand, I saw the spectacle Robert had orchestrated. He had set up a massive white catered tent near the main barn. There were luxury SUVs parked on the grass, the kind with tinted windows and out-of-state plates. Caterers were carrying trays of champagne. In the distance, silhouetted against the gray sky on the northern ridge, the metallic spire of the telemetry tower loomed like a parasite latched onto our dirt. I parked my rental car out of sight behind the silos. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, adjusting my tie, ensuring my cover was perfectly seated. I checked my phone. One text message from the FBI lead agent. Assets in position. You have the green light. I stepped out of the car. The crunch of my low quarters on the gravel was the only sound I made as I walked toward the tent. The battlefield was prepped. The enemy was comfortable raising glasses of champagne, toasting to a harvest of lies and treason. It was time to bring the scythe. I walked toward the white tent, my footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The air smelled of impending rain, mixed with the jarring, out-of-place scent of expensive catered food and imported cologne. Through the clear vinyl walls of the tent, I could see Uncle Robert holding court. He was wearing a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than the tractor my grandfather had driven for 20 years. He was laughing, a glass of champagne in one hand, clapping the shoulder of a man in a sharp black suit. There were half a dozen of these men scattered around the tables, the investors. They didn't look like agricultural specialists. They had the stiff, hyper-aware posture of foreign intelligence operatives operating in hostile territory. They thought they were the predators in the scenario. They had no idea they were already in the cage. I stepped into the tent. The sharp olive green of my Class A uniform stood out like a warning flare against the sea of gray and black suits. The chatter died down almost instantly. The foreign operatives turned their eyes, sweeping over the ribbons on my chest, calculating the sudden variable. Uncle Robert froze mid-laugh. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped and I saw pure, unadulterated panic flash in his eyes. But he was a career grifter, and his recovery was fast. He plastered on a wide, beaming smile and marched toward me, arms outstretched. "Carter, you made it!" He boomed his voice, echoing under the canvas. He turned to the men in the suits. "Gentlemen, my niece, Captain Carter, an American hero and the owner of this beautiful estate." He moved in for a hug. I didn't raise my arms. I didn't step back. I just stood there, perfectly still, looking at him with the same detached focus I used to lock onto a target in my gunner's display. Robert's arms awkwardly dropped to his sides. He cleared his throat, suddenly hyper-aware of the silence in the tent. "Well," he chuckled, a nervous edge bleeding into his tone. "I know you're on a tight schedule, kiddo. The men here have a flight to catch back to the coast. Let's get this irrigation grant signed so we can properly celebrate." He gestured to a large oak table at the center of the tent. Resting on it was a thick stack of legal documents bound in a leather folio and a gold-plated pen. I walked over to the table. The foreign operatives shifted slightly, tightening their perimeter. I looked down at the document. The cover page read, "Infrastructure Enhancement Grant." I flipped to the second page, then the third. "An irrigation grant," I said, my voice quiet, carrying easily through the silent tent. "That's right," Robert said, stepping up beside me, tapping the signature line on the final page. "State of the art. It's going to save the harvest. Just sign right there on the bottom line, Carter." I didn't pick up the pen. I looked up, making eye contact with the lead operative standing across the table. "It's fascinating," I said, my tone ice cold. "I've never seen an irrigation grant that requires a 99-year lease agreement. I've also never seen one that grants unrestricted access to a high-frequency telemetry tower, broadcasting encrypted data packets on a frequency that just happens to mirror the tactical bandwidth of the Strategic Air Force Base 10 miles from here." The lead operative's face went entirely rigid. He subtly shifted his weight, his hand twitching toward the inside of his jacket. Uncle Robert let out a high-pitched, breathless laugh. "Carter, what are you talking about? It's just a water pump array. The legal jargon it's just standard county boilerplate. Don't worry about it. Just sign." "You told me the dirt was drying up, Robert," I said, finally turning to look at my uncle. "You told me the crops were dead. You filed $1 million in catastrophic loss claims with the USDA to line your pockets while you sold the actual harvest for cash." Robert's face drained of color. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for gravity to notice. "Carter, who told you that? That's a lie. I'm protecting the family." "And then you sold the airspace above it to a foreign shell company," I continued, my voice entirely flat. I reached into the breast pocket of my uniform jacket and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper with the seal of the Department of Justice at the top. I placed it over his fake lease. "I'm not signing your lease, Robert," I said. I picked up the gold-plated pen. "But I will sign this. This is a federal consent decree. As the sole legal owner of this property, I am formally revoking your power of attorney, and I am granting the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States Department of Agriculture unrestricted authorization to search, seize, and dismantle every single asset on this land." I signed my name with sharp, precise strokes. The lead operative snapped a command in a foreign language. The men in suits bolted for the exit. They didn't make it past the tent flaps. The perimeter erupted. The deafening roar of heavy engines shattered the quiet afternoon as a dozen black SUVs tore across the pristine lawn, surrounding the tent in seconds. The doors didn't even wait for the vehicles to fully stop before they flew open. Dozens of federal agents in tactical gear poured out. FBI counterintelligence, USDA Office of Inspector General, United States Marshals. "FBI, nobody move! Keep your hands where we can see them." The foreign operatives were slammed against the oak table, zip ties cinching their wrists before they could even draw a breath. Uncle Robert backed away, his hands raised in the air, his chest heaving in terror. A senior FBI agent stepped in front of him, flashing a gold badge. Robert Miller, you are under arrest for federal bank fraud, wire fraud, false statements against the United States government under Title 18, Section 1014, and violations of the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act. The agent grabbed Robert's arm, spun him around, and locked the steel cuffs onto his wrists. The click of the metal was the loudest sound in the world. "Carter!" Robert screamed, his voice breaking as they shoved him toward the door. "Carter, please! I'm your uncle, I'm your family, we can fix this! Just tell them it's a misunderstanding. I kept the farm!" I stood by the table, my hands clasped behind my back, in the position of parade rest. I watched him struggle. "You didn't keep the farm, Robert," I said softly, though I knew he could hear me. "You dug your own grave on it." Within an hour, the property was completely locked down. The caterers were gone, the luxury cars were impounded, USDA agents were cataloging the massive paper trail of insurance fraud in Robert's makeshift field office. On the northern ridge, a team of FBI technicians was already cutting through the concertina wire to dismantle the espionage tower. Robert's life was systematically erased. The federal government didn't just arrest him. They economically annihilated him. The USDA initiated a massive clawback, seizing his personal bank accounts, his vehicles, and his home to recoup the stolen crop insurance funds. The IRS slapped him with a tax evasion indictment for the black market grain sales. By sunset, Uncle Robert was sitting in a federal holding cell, facing decades in a maximum security penitentiary, completely destitute. The foreign operatives were quietly transferred to an undisclosed federal facility. Their government would disavow them. They would simply cease to exist. I walked out to the edge of the fields as the sun began to set behind the heavy clouds. The rain finally started to fall, washing away the tire tracks the tactical vehicles had left in the grass. Dirt doesn't care who owns it. It doesn't care about greed or lies or the bloodlines of the people who walk across it. But I care. My grandfather cared. Uncle Robert thought he could sell our legacy out from under me. He thought the dirt belonged to whoever stood on it. He forgot that I belong to the military that protects it.